I'm Ava Reed, and let me tell you a story. My story. The one they tried to erase. For most of my life, I believed I was part of something. A family, a legacy, a name that meant something in the crisp circles of Beacon Hill society, printed on brass plaques and business cards. I played the part, the obedient daughter, the poised wife, the woman who never asked too many questions. Until one day my husband laughed as he left me stranded on a foreign street. And no one came looking. That was the first time I realized I didn't belong. Not to him, not to the father who'd stopped answering my calls, not to the house I grew up in, where my childhood bedroom had been repainted as a wine lounge. I was a ghost. Airbrushed out of photos, crossed off from inheritance documents, and blamed for fractures I didn't cause. But when you lose everything, status, money, even the illusion of love, you start to see clearly. I learned how to survive on 80 euros and stubbornness. I learned the weight of an honest day's work, the sweetness of bread kneaded by your own hands. And I found people who saw me not as a disappointment, but as a person worth keeping. This isn't a sob story. It's a reckoning. Because when I came back, I didn't come to knock. I came to kick the damn door down. My name wasn't on the mailbox anymore. Not scratched out, not covered up, gone, like it had never been there. I stood on the front steps of the Reed estate with my suitcase in hand, heart thudding louder than the brass knocker I hadn't touched yet. The January air bit at my cheeks, a Boston wind that seemed to remember me just enough to punish me for coming back. The last time I stood here, I had been 22 and naive, thinking family was something unconditional. Now I was 29 and humbler, with a spine hardened by absence. The wrought iron gate had opened easily with the old code, my first surprise, but when I reached the front door, my key didn't fit. That was the second. I stood there too long, enough for a neighbor to glance at me through a frosted window across the street. They didn't wave. No one ever waved in Beacon Hill unless they had a reason to pretend you mattered. I pulled out my phone, half expecting my father's number to work again. It didn't. Neither did Vanessa's. That, at least, was no surprise. My mother, my real mother, had died when I was 11. Vanessa came a year later with red lips, a clipped laugh, and an iron will beneath her silk blouses. By the time I'd turned 17, I learned to swallow my words the way she swallowed white wine, gracefully, with a twist of disdain. But today, I wasn't here to play her version of Ava. I pressed the doorbell. Once. Twice. On the third ring, the door cracked open. "Can I help you?" asked a housekeeper I didn't recognize. Her accent was Eastern European, her voice clipped and professional. "I'm Ava," I said. "Ava Reed." She blinked. I wasn't told to expect anyone by that name. "I grew up here," I said, hating how defensive it sounded. She didn't answer. She just held the door half closed and glanced over her shoulder. A few moments later, Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, draped in black cashmere, her expression unreadable. She descended slowly, like a queen reluctant to address the village girl knocking at the gates of her castle. "Ava," she said at last, "this is unexpected." "I've been emailing," I said. "I've been busy." Busy bearing my name, apparently. I snapped. Her lips twitched. "Let's not do this here." "I don't have anywhere else to do it." She sighed and motioned for me to follow her into the study. I stepped inside and tried not to look like someone returning to a crime scene. Everything smelled the same. Leather polish and bergamot. But the furniture had changed. The photo wall, once filled with childhood pictures, now featured corporate awards and Vanessa's charity gala snapshots. I was nowhere. The door clicked shut behind me. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He's in a meeting," she said, sitting gracefully in the armchair beside the fireplace. I doubt he'd want to be disturbed. "He hasn't replied to me in over a year." "Because you left, Ava," I was forced out. "Details," she said, waving a hand. You threw a tantrum at the will signing. You accused me of manipulating your father, then disappeared. You did manipulate him." Vanessa stood, walked to a small cabinet, and pulled out a slim folder. "Do you remember this?" she asked, tossing it on the coffee table. I looked down. It was a psychiatric assessment from a clinic in Brooklyn, diagnosing me, apparently, with paranoid delusions and self-destructive behavior. My mouth went dry. I never went to this hospital. "Well," she said, "records say otherwise. It was submitted as supporting documentation when your father amended the estate plan." "That's a lie." "Ava," she said, her tone now dipped in artificial pity, "you've always been dramatic. Sometimes it hurts your credibility." I stood, pulse roaring. "Is this why my key doesn't work? Why I've been erased from every document? From our family?" "Sweetheart," she said, smug now, "you were never good for the brand." I didn't scream. I didn't throw the folder or accuse her of what I now suspected. I just turned, walked out of the study, and stepped back into the snow-lined street, where the house I once knew had just locked me out in every possible way. I didn't remember walking back to the rental car, only that the cold no longer bit. It burned. The folder Vanessa handed me weighed nothing in everything. I shoved it into my tote without looking again, afraid that if I read every word right now, I might turn around and torch the house behind me. That wouldn't bring justice, just more labels: unstable, impulsive, dangerous, exactly the narrative they'd laid out in that forged report. I drove aimlessly for a while, past the same brownstones and cobbled intersections that once felt like home. Beacon Hill was glossy in the afternoon light, all historic charm and silent condemnation. I ended up parked outside an old cafe on Charles Street, one I hadn't visited since college. The owners had changed, the smell hadn't. I ordered black coffee and sat by the window, staring down at the folder. I didn't open it. Instead, I stared at the window's reflection. My face? Older, sharper, paler. A woman they no longer recognized. A woman I was beginning not to recognize either. How did it happen? Not the obvious parts, not Vanessa or the fake psych eval, but the moments I let it happen, all the times I laughed off her snide comments, dismissed her needling digs as just insecurity, all the years I put my ambitions on the shelf to keep peace, to stay within the curated image of a Reed woman, elegant, silent, serviceable. I'd gone from honors graduate to ornamental spouse so slowly, I'd mistaken the suffocation for comfort. My phone buzzed. Gabriel. The name flashed across the screen. I hadn't heard from him in over 6 months. I stared at it until it stopped. Then again. A second call. This time, I answered. "Avon," he breathed, like he wasn't sure I'd pick up. I didn't speak. "Look, I just heard about your dad." "I'm sorry. I wanted to check on you." "You knew he died?" "It's in the papers." "You didn't reach out when I disappeared in Florence," I said, voice tight. "You didn't check on me then." A pause. "I thought you needed space." "No, Gabrielle. You left me on a sidewalk with 80 euros and a dead phone. That's not space. That's abandonment." He sighed. "Can we talk in person?" I don't think there's anything left to say," he hesitated. "They told me you were unwell, that you'd had some kind of breakdown. That's why they removed you from the will." There it was. He believed it, too. "Goodbye, Gabriel." I hung up. By the time I made it back to my motel, the sky had turned leaden. Snow drifted down like ash. I opened the folder for the first time. Every line was calculated. Words like delusional, borderline, prone to dissociation. Signed by a psychiatrist I'd never met, at a facility I'd never visited. The signature was blurry, but the stamp was clean. Brooklyn Mental Health Institute. I Googled the name. It existed, but the address listed on the document was wrong. A tiny knot formed in my chest. Sloppy. Whoever fabricated this hadn't even fact-checked the postal code. I printed the report out and started underlining inconsistencies. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just reacting, I was documenting. Later that night, I dug through my old email backups. A string of messages from 7 years ago surfaced. One from my freshman year advisor at RISD. Subject line, urgent. Conflicting parental records need clarification. I'd ignored it then, too consumed with proving myself in a world already built on assumptions, but now it stood out like a flare. Attached to the email was a scanned intake form. It listed my mother, Elizabeth Marino, but next to father's name, the space had once read Thomas Reed, now crossed out and replaced with the scribbled unknown. I closed my laptop, heart hammering. They didn't just want to erase me. They wanted to erase my bloodline. And suddenly, for the first time since I was a child, I wondered, what if Thomas Reed was never a father at all? He drove off laughing. And just like that, I ceased to exist. It wasn't just the sound of tires skidding on the cobblestones that gutted me. It was the laughter, Gabrielle's echoing behind the exhaust cloud, carelessly tossed into the air like the punchline of a joke I was never in on. The narrow street in Florence was quiet now, save for the distant clink of wine glasses and a street violinist tuning his strings near the Arno. I stood there, stunned, in the same beige coat I'd bought for this trip, still clutching the stupid tourist guide he'd handed me an hour before, and my duffel bag. That's all I had. No phone charger, no passport, no credit cards. He'd offered to carry them for convenience earlier that morning, slipping them into his coat pocket while ordering another round of grappa with his old Princeton buddies. Now, I stood alone in a foreign country, not even sure how to pronounce the name of the hotel we'd been staying at. The fight had started small, a comment about his drinking at lunch. Me suggesting we head back. Him snapping about how I was always managing him. Then Pete, his college roommate, had laughed and said, "She still got the leash on you, huh?" It escalated in the alley outside the cafe. Remember the smell of baked tomato and diesel? The way Gabriel's eyes sharpened when he was angry, like he wasn't drunk at all. "You have your purse," he'd sneered. "Are your passport?" I nodded, unsure. "Good. You'll figure it out. You're brilliant, remember?" Then he got into the car. I hadn't believed he would leave until the taillights disappeared for good. For a moment, I convinced myself this was some elaborate punishment, some twisted way to teach me a lesson. But as the minutes dragged into an hour and my calls went straight to voicemail, reality clawed its way in. I tried Pete, blocked Marco, block. Every man who toasted with us at lunch, block, block, block. That's when the panic set in. I had €80, 0 cents in my coat pocket. Around $37, 0 cents. Not enough for a train, definitely not enough for a flight. I was stranded, completely and utterly. I walked. For hours, not because I knew where to go, but because standing still made me feel like I might collapse. I passed art galleries I couldn't afford to enter, sidewalk cafes full of honeymooners and jet-setters. I was invisible, an abandoned woman in stylish boots. As night fell, I found a dim little pension above a bakery, 2 flights up, no elevator, the kind of place where the soap came in foil wrappers and the beds had springs you could feel through the sheet. The woman at the front desk spoke no English, but patted my arm when I handed over my crumpled euros. "You stay safe," she said in accented Italian, the only words I understood. That night, I lay fully clothed on top of the covers, staring at the cracked ceiling. He blocked me. The man I married, the one who gave me a ring, who kissed my forehead every night and made lattes with foam hearts. He blocked me like a scam caller. I should have cried, should have thrown something, but instead I just froze. I didn't know what to feel, because deep down, part of me wasn't surprised. Gabriel had always loved control more than connection. He liked the version of me that fit into his curated world, polite, poised, perfectly silent when he spoke over me. The minute I started asking real questions about our future, about my career, he'd started calling me difficult. The next morning, I walked the length of the town, searching for a familiar face, a hotel that might know our tour group, anything that felt like a thread back to sanity. No one recognized me. It was as if the life I'd just been living had already been scrubbed clean. When I passed a storefront with a travel agency, I almost laughed. Their window display featured a poster that said, "Find yourself in Florence." I wanted to tear it down. Instead, I sat on a bench and stared at my phone. Battery at 9%. No replies, no updates, just my own messages sitting cold and unanswered. I'd been erased again. But this time, I wasn't going to vanish quietly. By the third day, I stopped expecting to be rescued. It's strange how quickly you adjust to being forgotten. At first, every sound from the street, an engine revving, a car door slamming, sent me flying to the window, heart in my throat, thinking maybe Gabrielle had sobered up and realized he'd gone too far, that he'd come back, apologize, hand me a plane ticket home, and spin it all into a cautionary tale we'd laugh about years from now. He didn't. No calls, no messages, no Gabriel. I rationed my cash down to coins. Half a panini for lunch, a small espresso in the morning, nothing more. The bakery below the pension let me stay one extra night after the landlady mistakenly doubled the rate, but I knew I was running out of time and options. The woman's face softened when she handed me a roll with my coffee. "You go home," she said, not unkindly, but where was home? I thought about calling my father, but the thought of hearing Vanessa's voice on the other end paralyzed me. I imagined her answering and saying, "See, even abroad, she can't survive without drama." Instead, I walked to the local police station, holding on to the last frayed thread of hope that someone, anyone, might help. The officer behind the glass partition blinked at me like I was just another overstressed tourist who'd lost her passport. "Abandoned by husband?" he asked, scribbling something in barely legible English. "Yes," I said. "He left me here." "Domestic matter," he replied. "You report. Maybe embassy helps." He handed me a copy of a flimsy form with a stamp in blue ink and sent me on my way with a half-hearted nod. I walked out into the pale light of afternoon with no idea what to do next. That's when I saw it. A narrow alley I hadn't noticed before, sloping downhill toward a small bus terminal. No taxi, no tourists, just one parked coach with a cracked windshield and a sign in the window, "Roma, overnight." I checked my wallet. The pawn value of my ring was still tucked between some receipts I couldn't bear to throw away. I hadn't wanted to part with it, not because I still loved Gabrielle, but because I hated the idea of selling a memory. But a memory wouldn't get me out of Florence. That evening, I stood in front of a tiny pawn shop on Via della Scala, my breath fogging the glass. Inside, a man with thick glasses and a tired smile appraised the ring without judgment. "It's beautiful," he said, then offered me less than half its value. I nodded and handed it over anyway. With the cash, I bought a ticket for the overnight bus to Rome. No plan beyond that, just forward. The bus was nearly empty. I took a window seat in the back and kept my backpack close. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the lights inside dimmed, and the soft hum of tires and quiet breathing lulled me into a strange half-sleep. My dreams were fractured, my mother calling my name from a staircase that never ended, Vanessa whispering behind closed doors, Gabriel laughing from behind a mirror I couldn't break. When I awoke, it was already morning. Rome blurred past the window like a memory I didn't want to keep. From the central terminal, I found another bus, this time headed west. No destination in mind, just away, towards something that didn't smell like betrayal. By the end of the second day, I had run out of names to contact, out of money, and out of the version of myself that still believed I was someone's priority. So when I stepped off a rattling regional bus onto a dusty road flanked by olive trees and wildflowers, I didn't know the name of the town. I didn't care. I just needed to stop moving before I collapsed. The sun was setting. a wash of gold and blood orange across the hilltops. My water bottle was empty, my sandals blistered my heels, and my muscles ached in ways I didn't know possible. But I kept walking, breath shallow, vision blurred, until my legs gave out beneath me. I collapsed in the middle of a gravel path, face first into the dust, my cheeks scraping the stones. Darkness folded around the edges of my sight. Maybe I'd sleep there. Maybe I wouldn't wake up at all. Then I heard her voice. Soft, urgent, foreign. "Thesis akoma?" A woman's voice. And then, "Hey, hey! Don't sleep here." Hands, steady, worn, warm, turned me over. I saw a lined face framed in white hair and a pair of sharp, worried eyes. "I've got you," she whispered. "You're safe now." In their soil, I planted more than olives. I buried the version of me they created. I woke up in a stranger's home, tucked under a faded quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. The morning light filtered through whitewashed curtains, casting pale stripes across the walls. For the first few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then the pain in my legs reminded me. The gravel path, the fall, the heat, the woman. She had found me when I was ready to disappear. A knock sounded, soft, hesitant. The door creaked open, and there she was, the woman with white hair and kind eyes, a steaming mug in both hands. "You sleep," she said, her English broken but warm. "Now, coffee." I tried to sit up, but soreness spread through every muscle. I took the cup with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." She pointed to herself. "Eleanor," I hesitated, then mirrored her gesture. "Ava." Eleanor smiled like we'd just made a pact. Later that morning, she helped me limp to the kitchen. A man sat at the table, tall and sun-darkened, with hands like knotty branches. He stood when he saw me. "Nick," Eleanor said, patting his shoulder. "My husband." He gave me a short nod, eyes unreadable but not unkind. The kitchen was nothing like the sterile, granite-countered perfection of my former life. This space lived, it breathed. Cast-iron pans hung above the stove. Dried herbs dangled from wooden beams. A stone sink overlooked an open field of olive trees stretching into the sun. They let me stay. No questions, no assumptions, just a spare room and a bowl of soup every evening. I told them very little. They didn't ask for more. The next few days passed in soft rhythms. I learned to say thank you in Greek. I learned that Eleanor baked bread every Thursday, and Nick never spoke more than necessary. I learned that the silence in their home was not the kind that punished, but the kind that allowed. I wasn't sure why they took me in. Maybe I reminded them of someone. Maybe they were just good. Either way, I couldn't leave, not yet. One afternoon, Eleanor handed me a basket and pointed outside. "Eggs," she said, "from chickens? You try?" I nodded, grateful for something to do. I walked out barefoot into the sunlit yard, my feet still tender but improving. The chicken coop stood behind a small shed. The chickens scattered as I approached, clucking indignantly. I reached into a nest box and pulled out a warm egg, surprised by how alive it felt. When I brought the basket back inside, Eleanor clapped gently, pleased. "You learn fast," she said. The days lengthened, each one marked by small tasks. Hanging laundry, picking herbs, stirring pots on the stove. I began to feel useful. Not decorative, not tolerated, useful. I hadn't felt that in years. There were no mirrors in the guest room, but one afternoon I caught my reflection in the window. Skin darker from sun, hair tied back with a rag, hands rougher, steadier. A different woman. One evening after dinner, Eleanor gestured for me to follow her to the sitting room. She opened a carved wooden box on the mantel and pulled out a stack of photographs. She handed me one. A girl in her 20s with Eleanor's eyes and Nick's crooked smile. "Sophia," she said, voice catching slightly. "Our daughter." I studied the photo. The girl looked nothing like me, and yet, something about her posture, the curve of her mouth, it was familiar. She lives in Australia now, Eleanor continued, miming a plane flying far away. We not see... long time. She pulled out another photo. A baby? Sophia's daughter, I assumed. Grandchild? She said softly. Never met. There was grief in her voice, but not bitterness, only longing. I looked down at the photo of Sophia again. She looked happy, free. Stay, Eleanor said suddenly, placing her hand over mine. Help here, learn, okay? I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Work, she clarified, not charity. It was the kindest offer I'd received in years. I nodded. Yes, I'll stay, I'll help. She smiled, then stood to fetch tea. Alone for a moment, I turned the photo over. Something fell out, tucked behind the cardboard backing, small folded paper. A letter. I opened it slowly, hands trembling, written in elegant cursive. If this reaches you, it means I've failed, but I hope someone else might understand. She needs to know. Underneath was a hospital letterhead, and a name. Elizabeth Marino. My mother. I stared at the name. Elizabeth Marino. Like it might vanish if I blinked too hard. My mother's name. My real mother? For a moment, I couldn't move. The world felt suspended, caught between then and now. I ran my fingers along the hospital letterhead, the creases in the paper, the signature that had begun to fade. The date was 28 years ago, the same year I was born. The hospital listed was in Naples, Florida, not Italy. It didn't make sense. My parents had always said I was born in Boston. But then again, they'd said a lot of things. That night, I lay awake in the small guest room, listening to the cicadas outside, the occasional creak of wooden beams settling. My mind reeled. Who was Elizabeth Marino? Why was this letter hidden behind Sophia's photo? I needed to know more. The next morning, I helped Eleanor fold laundry, my thoughts miles away. Eleanor, I began cautiously, did Sophia ever mention Boston? She paused, a bedsheet in her hand. No, why? I shrugged, just curious. She gave me a long, searching look, but didn't push further. That afternoon, I returned to the wooden box and searched it more carefully. Between old letters and faded receipts, I found a manila envelope. Inside, a folded birth certificate. At first, I thought it was Sophia's, but no, it had my birthday. And my name. Ava Elizabeth Marino. Father, mother, Elizabeth A. Marino. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I wasn't a reed, I wasn't his daughter. I stumbled back into the kitchen, clutching the paper like a lifeline. Nick looked up from a bowl of olives he was curing. You okay? He asked, gruff but not unkind. I nodded, too quickly. But everything inside me was screaming. I spent the next few days in a haze. I helped Eleanor harvest olives. I stirred giant pots of tomato sauce. I smiled when prompted. But inside, the storm raged. If Thomas Reed wasn't my father, then who was? And why had they lied? The only person who might know was gone. My mother, Elizabeth Marino, was just a name now, etched in fading ink. I didn't even know if she was alive. I took the birth certificate and folded it into the bottom of my backpack, along with the letter. I needed answers, but not here. Not now. One evening, as we shelled peas on the porch, Eleanor turned to me. You are not just running, are you? She asked quietly. I looked at her, startled. She didn't press, just kept working. But I felt her words settle inside me. I wasn't just running. I was circling back. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered outside into the olive groves. The moon painted silver on the leaves, the air heavy with the scent of soil and something wild. I thought of my life before, sterile, cold, planned to the minute, the house on Marlborough Street, the dinner parties, the silent disappointments. This This chaos of questions and dirt-stained fingers felt more like truth. When I turned to head back, I noticed something near the stone wall at the edge of the grove. A wooden crate, half buried. Nick's handwriting on the side, Sophia, private. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside, books, letters, a photo album, and a sealed envelope addressed to Ava Reed. My breath caught. Hands trembling, I opened it. Inside was a single hair strand taped carefully to a card, and a note. DNA doesn't lie. Test it if you need to. You deserve the truth, S. I froze. Sophia had known. She'd known who I was, and she'd tried to tell me. But Sophia was gone, dead in a car accident 2 years ago, or so I'd been told. Unless it's a strange thing watching your entire life unspool because of a single strand of hair. I sat on the edge of the bed in the Marino's guest room, holding the envelope Sophia had left behind. The hair strand felt almost too small to carry so much weight, yet in my gut I knew it would shatter everything. I didn't tell Eleanor or Nick, not yet. Some truths felt too fragile to share before they were fully formed. Instead, I went to the small pharmacy in the nearby town, where a kind-eyed woman with reading glasses sold me a home DNA kit. She didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that. I mailed the samples to a private lab in Boston listed under my mother's old nonprofit. It was the same lab the Reeds had once used for paternity confirmation during a legal spat I was never supposed to know about. I remembered the name from an old envelope I had seen in my father's desk drawer as a child. Then came the waiting. The days dragged on with an unbearable tension. I tried to bury myself in farm chores, in harvesting, cleaning, canning, anything. But at night, when the house quieted and the cicadas rose in their chorus, the questions whispered louder. What if I was never a Reed? What if Elizabeth Marino had died thinking her child was lost? What if she hadn't died at all? Eleanor noticed the shift in me. She always did. One evening, over a dinner of roast lamb and garlic potatoes, she set down her fork. "You're holding something, Ava?" I nodded. "I'll tell you when I know for sure." She didn't push, just reached out and gently squeezed my hand. A week later, the email came. I was in the kitchen, scrubbing tomatoes for sauce when my phone buzzed. The subject line hit me like a blow. Paternity test results, confidential. I hummed. I locked myself in the bathroom, hands trembling as I opened the file. My breath caught. Thomas Reed, 0% probability of paternity. Everything went quiet inside me. No anger, no sorrow, just space and emptying. For years, I'd tried to earn that man's approval, his pride, his love. And now, scientifically, legally, genetically, he wasn't even my father. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the shame. I simply wasn't his. The freedom of it hit me before the grief. I sank to the tiled floor, a strange, bitter laugh escaping me. He had disowned me for something that was never mine to carry. I left the bathroom hours later, the printout folded in my jeans pocket. That night, I told Eleanor and Nick. Eleanor wept quietly, brushing my hair back as if I were her own. Nick said nothing, just set an extra log on the fire and handed me a glass of wine. They didn't ask what I'd do next, but I knew. I had to go back. Not to reclaim the Reed name, God, no, but to tear away the masks. The first step? Get the one person who might know the truth to talk. His name was Ethan Hale. He had been Thomas Reed's college roommate, best friend, and, if rumors were true, godfather to me before something had driven them apart. I hadn't seen Ethan in years, but I remembered his voice. Deep, rough, always kind. And I remembered the way Vanessa, my stepmother, used to tense whenever his name was mentioned. I found his old address in a letter my mother had tucked into her college diary. He lived in Cape Cod, or at least he had. I borrowed Nick's old pickup the next morning. He didn't ask where I was going, just handed me the keys with a nod and a packed lunch Eleanor had prepared. Cape Cod was a 4-hour drive north, the kind of quiet coastal town where secrets age like wine and suspicion clings to every creaking porch board. I hadn't been there since I was a child, maybe 6 or 7. A summer visit that ended abruptly. I'd always been told Tomas had an emergency at work. Now, I wasn't so sure. I found the address scrawled in my mother's diary, 36, Lawson Pier Road. It led to a weathered gray house nestled among seagrasses and gull cries. The mailbox still bore the name E. Hale. For a moment, I sat in the truck, heart thudding like I was 17 again, about to confess a lie. Then I got out. I rang the bell, no answer, just the faint hum of wind chimes and the smell of salt. I turned to leave when the door creaked open. And there he was, Ethan Hale, grayer, thinner, but unmistakably him. Same sharp jaw, same eyes that had once softened at the sight of me. "Ava?" he asked, voice sandpaper soft. "Jesus, I thought you were in Switzerland or somewhere." I smiled tightly. "Italy, actually, long story." He studied me for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." His home was clean but cluttered with books, maps, and half-completed crossword puzzles. He poured me tea, no questions asked, and we sat across from each other like estranged blood relatives who hadn't agreed on the terms of reunion. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need the truth." He nodded. "Was Thomas Reed my father?" Silence. A gull screamed somewhere above us. Ethan looked down at his hands, then back up. "No," he said quietly, "he wasn't." I exhaled shakily, though I already knew. "I thought maybe you were." His mouth twisted. "No, but I wanted to be." I blinked. "Elizabeth was my friend before she met Thomas. I loved her. I never told her, not properly. When she got pregnant, I was already halfway across the country for work. By the time I came back, she was married, and you were already being raised as a Reed." "Then who—" Ethan shook his head. "I never knew. She never said." "But she was scared, Ava. Not just scared. Watched. Vanessa didn't like her. Said she was too idealistic. I think something happened the night your mother died that no one ever looked into." His words chilled me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded result. I placed it on the table. He read it. Didn't flinch. "I always wondered why Thomas was colder to you," he murmured. "Now I know." "Why didn't you say anything? Because I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" "From them." His voice hardened. "Vanessa made your mother's life hell. And Thomas let her." My hands clenched. "Do you know anyone who might know what happened that night?" He hesitated. "There was a nurse, a woman named Claire Atwood. She was working the ER that night. Your mother arrived with head trauma. I wasn't allowed in. Vanessa was, though, claimed she was your legal guardian. A few days later, Elizabeth was gone. No autopsy, no press. Claire might still be alive? She quit shortly after and moved west. I think she's in New Mexico now, Santa Fe." I nodded slowly. Santa Fe. One more road, one more thread to follow. I stood up. Ethan walked me to the door. "Ava," he said softly, "you deserve the truth. But truth has a cost." I looked at him. The man who had wanted to be my father, who had stayed silent for years. "So does silence," I replied. "They buried him in the rain, like the sky had something to say that no one else dared to." I arrived in Boston under gray clouds that seemed to mirror the hollow ache in my chest. Not grief, not exactly. Something more surgical. A cold readiness, a bone-deep awareness that this was no longer home if it ever had been. Thomas Reed was dead. A massive stroke, according to the obituary. Painless, swift, and above all, private. There was no phone call, no message, no invitation. I learned about the funeral the way strangers do, from a small column in the Boston Globe tucked between real estate ads and upcoming gallery events. The Reed family, of course, had kept it quiet. Vanessa never liked a crowd unless she could control it. I imagine she hoped I wouldn't find out at all. But I did. And I wasn't going to let them bury him, or the truth, without me. The church was one of those old, money, ivy-wrapped places on Beacon Hill, stone steps worn from decades of heels and grief. I walked up them slowly, each footstep a defiance, dressed in black, hair pulled back, jaw set like armor. Inside, the air was incense-heavy and suffocating. Organ music filled the space, dull and hollow. I spotted them immediately. Vanessa in a sharp black suit, flanked by Gregory, her golden boy, and a cluster of family friends I hadn't seen in years. The ones who whispered behind cocktail glasses and congratulated themselves on never asking too many questions. I slipped into a back pew. I wasn't here to mourn, I was here to speak. But first, I watched as the priest stumbled through a eulogy crafted by someone who had clearly never known Thomas Reed outside of boardroom headlines and press clippings. No mention of his daughter, not the real one, just a sanitized version of legacy, empire, dignity. When the priest invited those who loved and knew Thomas best to come forward, Gregory stood. His speech was short, polished, a few forced tears. A fond memory of Thomas teaching him to sail, which I knew for a fact was a lie. Gregory got seasick after 10 minutes on the yacht, but the room ate it up. Heads nodded, eyes shimmered. Then Vanessa rose. She didn't speak long either, just a few words about devotion, about a man who always put his family first. I almost laughed. Almost. But I held it in, until she said my mother's name. Elizabeth, she said, eyes dry, tone reverent. Thomas never stopped mourning her. I stood. The air shifted. Heads turned, whispers bloomed. I walked to the front, slow and deliberate. Vanessa's face froze, Gregory's jaw tensed, the priest stepped back, unsure. "I'm Ava Reed," I said into the microphone. "Thomas's daughter, the one this family forgot." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Someone dropped a prayer book. "I wasn't invited here today," I continued, voice steady, "but I came because this isn't just a funeral, it's the end of a lie. And maybe the start of the truth." Vanessa took a step forward. "Ava, this isn't the time." "Isn't it?" I cut in. "Because when is, Vanessa? When were you planning to tell them that? Thomas Reed wasn't my father? That he knew? That you all did?" Gasps again. Eyes darted. I pulled out the folder from my coat pocket. The one with the DNA results, the photographs, the birth certificate Elizabeth had hidden. "This is who I am, and this," I tapped the documents, "is who you are." The silence that followed was thick, cracked only by the priest whispering something to his assistant and a man in the third pew standing up abruptly. Ethan Hale. Yes, he had come. We locked eyes. And he nodded. I turned back to the congregation. "If you love Thomas, then you deserve to know the full story. Not the one Vanessa crafted over champagne brunches and charity events. The real one." I looked down at the coffin. "I'm not here to disgrace his memory. I'm here to finish what my mother couldn't." As I step down from the pulpit, someone hands me an envelope. No name, just one line in messy cursive. "The truth wasn't buried with him." The envelope weighed nothing, yet felt heavier than stone in my palm. I stepped out of the church into the cool drizzle, my breath fogging against the late autumn air. The whispers behind me followed like ghosts, my name tossed around in scandalous tones like I was the villain crashing a sacred rite. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them choke on the lies they so easily swallowed all these years. I ducked around the side of the building and slipped the envelope open. Inside was a folded piece of cream stationery, no logo, no header, just ink. Rushed, slanted, desperate. He kept a second will. Check the safe behind the bookshelf in his study. The combination is your mother's birthday. D.H. Ethan Hale. It had to be him. He hadn't spoken to me at the funeral, only nodded. But he was there. And he had known Thomas longer than almost anyone. His college roommate, Best man, trusted confidant, and perhaps something more. I didn't hesitate. By the time the last mourner had filed out of the church and the casket was lowered into the family plot, I was already in a rental car headed to the Reed estate in Brookline. It was odd coming back. The house looked the same, grand, cold, too perfect. The kind of place built not for comfort, but for image. A mausoleum of pride and silence. I slipped in through the side gate, the one the gardeners used. The alarm code hadn't changed. Vanessa had never been good with details. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and lemon polish. I moved quickly through the halls, muscle memory guiding me past portraits and locked doors. The study was dark. Thick curtains blocked out the gray light. I found the bookcase, moved the fake row of encyclopedias. There it was. A wall safe I'd never noticed as a child, disguised behind stories about dead kings and forgotten wars. I typed in the numbers. May 11th, 1979. My mother's birthday. Click. Inside were folders. Documents. A USB drive. A sealed envelope addressed to Ava. I took everything. Heart hammering, I slid the flash drive into my pocket and opened the envelope. The handwriting was Thomas's. Sharp, formal, controlled. If you're reading this, Ava, then I've already failed you one last time. I sat down, read the whole thing, every word. He knew. He knew he wasn't my biological father, had known for years. And yet, he'd kept it from me, not out of malice, but fear. Of the scandal, of Vanessa, of what it would do to his carefully built world. But he had also written a new will, leaving everything to me, not just the estate, but the shares in Reed Biotech, the trust, the coastal property in Maine my mother once loved, everything. He'd planned to tell me the truth on my last birthday, but he had a stroke the week before. Vanessa must have found the documents before I did, hid them, destroyed the copies, and held the funeral before I could get close. But she hadn't known about Ethan, or this safe, or the backup plan Thomas had started to put in place when his conscience began to whisper louder than her threats. I stared at the documents. This wasn't just about reclaiming my name anymore. It was about legacy, justice, truth. The house had locked me out once. Now it was mine. Before I left, I checked the security footage like instinct. There, on the monitor, timestamped just hours before Thomas's stroke, was Vanessa. In his office, holding a syringe. They thought erasing my name would erase me, but names are written in more than ink. They're carved into truth, and truth has a habit of resurfacing. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically. The AC hummed low, barely noticeable beneath the murmurs of tension rising in waves from both sides of the gallery. But it was the kind of cold that crawled beneath your skin. The kind that came from betrayal, from years of silence, and from family members sitting across from you as if you were a stranger trying to rob them. I sat beside my attorney, Jillian Marks. Fierce, relentless, and worth every cent I had begged, borrowed, and bartered to pay her. Across the aisle, Vanessa wore a pearl gray dress and a face like stone. Gabriel sat beside her, jaw tight, pretending this wasn't the circus it had become. Around them, extended relatives, aunts, cousins, family friends whispered and avoided my eyes. They had all chosen sides long ago. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through a file that now contained 2 conflicting wills and 1 damning video clip. My chest tightened. This was it. Years of exile, months of investigation, and days since I found the truth, buried in Thomas's safe, had led to this morning. Jillian leaned toward me. Remember, calm. Let the evidence speak. I nodded, fingers curled tightly around the locket at my neck, my mother's. The opposing attorney started first, attempting to discredit the second will. He called it convenient, unverified, possibly fabricated. Then Jillian stood. and burn the courtroom down. Not with volume, but with precision. She projected the video onto the screen. Vanessa, time-stamped 3 nights before Thomas's stroke, entering his study, disabling the camera, then forgetting one in the hallway was still active. The syringe, the confrontation, the scream before she turned off the sound. Shock rippled across the gallery. Then came the will notarized, backed by the statement from Ethan Hale, now conveniently on a sabbatical in Santa Fe, and the handwriting verified by 2 experts. Mr. Reed intended to pass everything to his daughter, Jillian said, standing tall, unwavering. He found redemption before his death, and now it is the court's duty to honor it. When she sat down, my heart pounded so loud, I thought it might shake the marble floor. The judge called a recess. In the hallway outside, Vanessa followed me. "You think this makes you better than us?" she hissed, voice sharp and venomous. "You were always an accident, Ava. A mistake your mother made that Thomas tried to fix, nothing more." I turned to her, steady. "No," I said. "I was the only truth in a house full of lies. And now? I'm done being quiet about it." Her slap never came, though I saw the twitch in her wrist. She turned and walked away. After lunch, the verdict came. The second will was upheld, the estate, the name, the legacy, restored. But I didn't smile. I just sat there, letting the weight settle in. My name wasn't erased. It had survived. Winning the case didn't bring closure. It only cracked the surface of a deeper truth, one I wasn't prepared to face. That night, I sat on the porch of the old Merino cottage, the ocean wind brushing my hair into knots, my hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of tea. Everything should have felt like resolution. I'd won! The name they tried to erase was mine again, legally, publicly, irrevocably. And yet, the letter sat on the table beside me, unopened. It had arrived earlier that morning at the courthouse, slid quietly into my bag by a clerk with an odd look in her eyes. No return address. Just my full name in bold black ink, Ava Sophia Marino, and the postmark, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ethan. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore the envelope open. Inside were 3 items. A single-page handwritten note in Ethan's steady, looping cursive. A black-and-white photograph, faded at the edges, a hospital file photocopy from 1995, marked confidential. I read the note first. "Ava, I couldn't be there, and for that I'm sorry. I owed your mother more than silence, and I owe you the truth now, no matter what it costs. What you found was only half the story. The real reason Vanessa hated you is in that folder I think you always knew deep down. Loved her. And I loved you too, even when I couldn't say it." My throat tightened. The hospital file was a pediatric intake form from St. Mary's Hospital, dated the night my mother died. The attending physician? Dr. Vanessa Reed. My blood ran cold. I flipped to the final page, a consent form, unsigned, written in rushed handwriting, with one note scribbled across the bottom, "Patient transferred under pseudonym, no next of kin notified." I stared at the old photograph. A woman with dark hair, holding a baby. Behind her, in the shadows of a hospital corridor, stood Ethan. Not Thomas. Ethan. Suddenly, a sound pulled me back. My phone buzzed. A message. No number, no name, just one line. "He's not dead. Come to Santa Fe if you want the whole truth." I froze. Thomas was dead. I saw his body. I saw his casket. Or had I? Thanks so much for watching Family and Heart Stories. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt dramas every week.